In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, Your Excellency Dr. Majed Ansari, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished gathering from academia, colleagues, international experts, decision makers, may the blessings of God be upon you all. It's my pleasure to welcome you all and to recognize our partners in the Regulatory Authority for Charitable Activities for organizing this event. And it's our pleasure to hold this event at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, which is one of the programs by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies with the aim of providing analyses, linking practices with theory and in partnership with international organizations to consolidate the response to emergencies. We live in a world with increasing tension and at the same time the necessity for intervention and response to emergency situations is increasing, and evidence-based research as a source for our work is becoming more important. The challenges we face are formidable indeed, and they require a very effective intervention. Research indicates that we really need evidence based research to make our interventions more effective. A number of these shows the huge gap between academic work and field work, and this has its impact on humanitarian and developmental work and proves that research-based evidence is a vital tool for improving our performance. Other research indicates that involving stakeholders and researchers contributes to more sustainable solutions. This compatibility between theory and theoretical knowledge and practices in the field is very important. The state of Qatar at the international level has provided a good example, and through the partnership with local and international organizations in response to humanitarian situations and emergencies, which calls for employing research in a more effective way. And Qatar, through initiatives like the Regulatory Authority for Charitable Activities, provides a legal framework and a regulatory framework, and this authority now plays an enormous role in consolidating the work based on evidence-based research, and hence the organization of this event, where the aims of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and the Regulatory Authority for Charitable Activities combine their efforts to contribute to this field. The program for today's event is aimed at serving this purpose. We will start by some remarks by Dr. Majed Al-Ansari, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That will be followed by a session on where a group of experts and representatives of study centers from different parts of the world will provide us with a summary of their expertise. And finally, in the closing session, will come up with some recommendations. Simultaneous interpretation is provided throughout this event, and the booklet for the conference is also available outside this room for those who are interested, and we hope that our discussions will contribute to the debate and how to work towards effective integration, enhancing the impact of research. Now I invite Mr. Saud Al-Adhba, who will deliver the welcoming remarks on behalf of our partners, the Regulatory Authority for Charitable Activities. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. May God's blessings be upon. My name is Saud Al-Adhba. I'm from the legal department of the Regulatory Authority for Charitable Activities, RACA. I convey to you the greetings from Mr. Ibrahim, who is away outside the country on an official business trip, and I would like on his behalf to welcome you to this important event, which is entitled Towards Effective Integration, Enhancing the Impact of the Research on Field Practice in the Third Sector, where a group of experts and decision makers will be gathering to discuss very important topics. We at RACA place huge importance on scientific research as an important pillar to improve the effectiveness and the performance by the charitable sector. And to serve this purpose, we believe in partnership with academic institutions, because this kind of compatibility and integration between field work and the result of scientific research will best serve all our purposes and contribute to improving our field practices and come up with the kind of innovative strategies to improve our performance on the ground. All of this has an impact on the work of the authority to improve our performance as a reflection of the strategy we adopted for ourselves, which believes in scientific research to improve the ways and means that the charitable sector contributes in all aspects of its work and benefit from international experiences, and to maximize the integration of research on field practice. We look forward to a fruitful discussion in this event, which will contribute to the work of our sector, and I would like to avail myself of this opportunity to express our appreciation of Dr. Majed Al-Ansari's presence with us and for the continued support by his ministry to all our activities. And thank you for your kind attention. Thank you, Mr. Muhammad. Please let me introduce Dr. Majed Al-Ansari. Dr. Majed Al-Ansari is the official spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he is an advisor to the Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs. He holds two master's degrees from Leeds University, Manchester University, and a BA from Manchester University, and he is involved in North-South relations, international affairs. Formerly, he was in charge of the research center at Qatar University and the Qatar International Academy for Security Studies. Assalamu alaikum. The name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate, may his blessings be upon his messenger Muhammad and all his companions and descendants and followers. I'm very happy to be amongst you this morning for many reasons. Maybe the most important reason is my longing and nostalgia to academic work. I'm one of these academics who found his way eventually to working for the government, and that meant being away from academia and research and things which are very important. And I always have had a passion for academia, and it's my pleasure to be with you this morning to remember my previous experience in academia. Also, at the professional level, I have worked with the third sector, whether through my work in the charitable sector or in academia. And I remember specifically that when I first started with Qatar University, my studies focused mainly on charitable activities, and Dr. Khaled remembers when we attended together a conference in Turkey in this context, and these conferences were very important and effective in reassessing our work in the third sector at the international level. And what pleases me even further by attending this event is the gap between academic and the research work and the charitable work, field work. The gap is getting bigger, in fact, and this is an attempt to narrow it a little bit. And I look forward to the discussions throughout this event and maybe in the future. And I would like to avail myself on this opportunity to mention some of the challenges, the main challenges that the chief amongst those is translating academic language into a language of practice in the field. I think this will have a huge impact on the third sector and its work in general. The first challenge in this translation is to do with the limited resources, because the resources are limited in the third sector and the beneficiaries bear the cost usually. And we see from the impact of research how this is impacted by inflation and how these administrative portions are distributed. I asked Dr. Ghassan, maybe this does not apply to this conference, but this conference, can we consider it as directly or indirectly contributing to humanitarian work? I don't know. There's a lot of room for argument here. If there is a project to uh, dig up wells or build schools or mosques, will the research work attached to this work will be part of the administrative portion attached to the project, or is it part and parcel of the cost of the project itself? And it's important. We have to understand that we have to have impact studies, of course. But all of this, uh, if you try to convince the donors that, for example, 20% of what you're going to donate will go on research, they will immediately react to you. And this has a real impact in the third sector, and anything to do with the research and the academic work on the one hand and the project itself. Whereas if the donor views the real benefit that we hope to achieve out of scientific research, they will discover that the biggest advantage will be more cost effectiveness and minimizing the waste. I was attending a conference on southern Philippines. An expert told me that you cannot imagine the number of mosques built in our country and the amount of wastage. He said every every donor wants to build a mosque or an Islamic center or an educational center, but how many of them want to contribute to the maintenance of these centers? Because we end up by having a lot of funds for building the schools, but not enough funds for maintaining them and renovating them if necessary. So we really need some research-based evidence here. I don't want to take too much of your time, and the room is full of experts who are more worthy of me to be listened to. But in the Arab world, the way we deal with research and evidence-based is not really appreciated as much. I worked for some research center. My role was to translate academic language into a language that the decision makers can benefit from and employ. I thought I achieved a lot, but when I moved to the government sector, I realized that not much has been achieved. And the timeline according to which we worked is not suitable at all with decision making, and trying to reconciliate the the actions we see every day is not really compatible with our own principles in academic writing. Sometimes it takes you 2 years to accomplish a research paper which can be published in a specialist journalist. We see, on the other hand, with decision makers, they take two, three, four, five decisions, and the paper is still being peer reviewed. The mechanisms of scientific research and the field needs direct decisions. If we face, for example, a humanitarian disaster somewhere in the world, by the time we respond, we start moving, there is no space, there is no room. For example, if an earthquake hits an area, we have no time to send a research team to write up a paper and present the paper to the decision maker, because by then the decision would have been taken 2 weeks earlier. So what we need is to find mechanisms which can turn the scientific research into a kind of an action or proposals which are more suitable to the decision makers. Of course, we are not saying that we should not have any strategic work within the context of assessing and viewing and reviewing our perceptions. Now, in the Arab world, we are talking about huge figures when it comes to the budgets of charitable organizations. Are these figures proportional to the impact of these organizations when it comes to these hotspots in the world or not? I leave this to you to assess. But undoubtedly, the amount of resources we are expending is monumental, but the impact, I cannot say that. And in the international context, sometimes we see the impact is more on the other side, which is causing the disaster. And of course, this does not undermine our determination and good intentions. We all aim well and mean well, And we hope that scientific research can inform us to come up with some solutions. Before I conclude, I would like to express my thanks to you all because through your discussions and through the partnership through charitable organizations and the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies is an exceptional experience really we should build on, and I invite you all to make it a beginning. I'm sure it's a beginning for more kind of work based and linked directly to the field through improving the relationship. I also thank you and urge you and remind you that there is a necessity for more young men and women who are experts. We have a handful, not more, and the need is very dire for this kind of expertise. The mixing between academic and research based work and the field work. I thank Dr. Ghassan and all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and my best wishes for a successful conference.
Thank you very much, Dr. Majed. Before moving on to the next session, allow me to reiterate that this conference, God willing, will not just be a convention, but it is a platform for networking, for exchanging ideas, and turning our ambitions into tangible results. Let us start with the first session. Once more, I welcome you all. In this session, in the three sessions, we will be listening to insights and expertise from representatives of Arab, local, regional, and international bodies. We will start this session and allow me to introduce the speakers. We have Dr. Shireen Taraboulsi McCarthy and Dr. Salim Salama, Dr. Khaled Shati from Kuwait. We will start with Dr. Sheirne and allow me to introduce her. Dr. Sheirne is currently the Director of Impact and Change of START Network UK. This is an international network that includes over 100 aid agencies and aims at affecting change in humanitarian transformation. And she was also the founder of Nutson Network, and she works also at the Center for Social Studies. Dr. Shireen worked also on research in the Overseas Development Institute Global, and she is also worked at the University of Oxford, has over 20 years of experience in humanitarian and developmental research and conflict and security, focusing on Africa, Middle East, and UK. She has a PhD in international development from the University of Oxford. Go ahead, Dr. Shireen, please.
Okay, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And this is not my first engagement with the Center for Humanitarian Studies. I've known Ghassan for so many years now, and every time I come here, there's so much more, action. There are a lot of activities going on, and there's a lot more interest in drawing on both international but also regional expertise. And I really regard the Center for Humanitarian Studies as a regional hub of knowledge and expertise on all issues related to conflict and humanitarian studies. So what I'm going to introduce to you today is it reflects on two things. One is my current institutional capacity. So my role as Director of Impact and Change within the START Network, and I'll give you an overview of what the START Network does and who we are. I do caveat the fact that I've only held the position for 3 weeks so far, so if you've got lots of questions about what we do, I might be able to answer some of them, but not all of them. And then the other part is going to really reflect on my experience working for over 20 years, as Ghassan mentioned, on both sides of the Mediterranean. So my career is nicely split. Most of it is now kind of the predominantly working out of London, but with a very strong emphasis on the Middle East and on Africa. Both at the Overseas Development Institute, the National Center for Social Research, and most recently within the START Network. But I also did work outside from within the region. And so I've got a very, I hope, interesting understanding of some of the challenges that you are facing in terms of linking research to practice, both from a British perspective, which is where I am at the moment, as well as from a regional perspective. So the START Network has a mission to change how the humanitarian system works. And it's quite an ambitious vision, right? So we work to transform the humanitarian sector. And we want to transform it in a way that would increase its efficiency, and that's something that was mentioned in the keynote speech earlier today, but also to ensure that the humanitarian sector is actually delivering dignified, equitable humanitarian response in different parts of the world, in conflict-affected contexts around the world. And because this mission is really ambitious, the way we work is very much dependent on our capacity to develop partnerships and collaborations globally. And so we are a network of over 100 international and national organizations that focus on humanitarian work. And we also have a focus on working through hubs. And hubs are like collections or groups of organizations working within regions. And so we've got 10 hubs, over 100 organizations that help enable us in order to deliver on this really ambitious and quite, and in my view, very important mission. The other thing that's really crucial about the START Network is that we like to define ourselves as a network of networks. And so we're moving in from an institutional structure where we were incubated through Save the Children, UK, into a much more decentralized kind of structure where we're trying to what you call seed power to organizations in the global south and in different parts of the world. Now we've got 3 key areas of focus. The first area of focus, as you can see, is locally led action. And I think there's a lot of nuance that gets missed into what we call locally led action. There seems to always be an emphasis that local is best and local is better, without really understanding the complexities of the dynamics between international, regional, and local. We are really keen to enable and strengthen locally led action, but from a more nuanced perspective and understanding of the political economy that surrounds local action. We're also, one of our key focal areas, also early and rapid financing. So one of the things that we try to push ahead with is the idea that instead of waiting for a crisis to happen and then responding to it, that we develop finance mechanisms that are innovative and that are anticipatory And that way, we enable countries to be prepared for a situation when a humanitarian crisis or a disaster would strike. And then the last thing is we have a culture of innovation and learning. So I head up a directorate that includes 4 key teams. One of them is evidence and learning. The other one, we have a dedicated team on systems, innovation, and change, and then communications and digital and advocacy. And the reason why I had those 4 teams together within a directorate is that because we see a continuum between those 4 teams. We think of research as feeding into innovation, innovation feeding into research, and I'll explain how we do that. And then the communications and advocacy parts are building on the evidence that we are generating. And so we see them all very much as interconnected and interdependent on one another. And we're keen to foster that culture of innovation. And one of the things that we've been pushing ahead with very strongly is how do we think about innovation? Instead of thinking about it in northern-led way, we start thinking about it from the ground up. We identify landscapes of innovation in the countries where we work and where we collaborate, and we identify opportunities to leverage that innovative capacity within those countries. So now I'm going to move to why robust evidence is central for us as START Network to shift power, but also again, bringing some insights from my own experience, having worked across the spectrum of academia, policy, social research, civil society. So I've had the experience of kind of leading research teams across all the 4 organizations of 4 types of institutions. And I've always had that mission of leveraging and local voices and shifting power. So why is it that evidence is really crucial and important for shifting power? And in the keynote earlier today, there was that discussion of sometimes it is felt like it's a luxury because things are moving so fast, in policy-making circles, and especially in humanitarian response, you're always reacting, right? Now, parallel to that, how do you take the time to develop high-quality evidence, and why is it important to develop high-quality evidence? And so I'm gonna share some of my thoughts there. So in 2011, the UK Humanitarian Emergency Response Review found that there's a worrying, really concerning lack of evidence in humanitarian action. And that kind of pushed forward a number of key actors and key stakeholders in that space to start thinking a little bit more critically about how to build and strengthen an evidence infrastructure that would then feed into humanitarian action. And the question here is not just a question of not knowing the impact of a humanitarian response. It is also a question of efficiency, right? If you don't know whether or not what the needs are in a humanitarian context, your humanitarian response is not going to be efficient. It is going to lead to a loss of resources. And I think that started kind of a movement or a change within at least the United Kingdom and the UK context to put more emphasis and more interest into developing evidence and feeding that into humanitarian action. Now, I think more than a decade later, I think there is a growing interest still in developing or connecting evidence to practice. And I think, and I see it increasingly happening in the global south, and I'll explain that a little bit further. But I do think that 10, 15 years ago, a conference like that, a conversation like we're having today would not have necessarily happened. In the same way that all the changes that we're witnessing in other countries within the Gulf region, like Kuwait, for example, and we're gonna hear from my Kuwaiti colleague over here, Saudi Arabia, North Africa, there have also been significant shifts over there. There's also been a shift in donor engagement, a lot more support to localizing research. So there is momentum, there is change that is happening. But that change is still met with a number of key challenges. And I will argue that those challenges are systemic challenges. They're not challenges that can be addressed in a piecemeal fashion. Now, a study that was published recently in 2021 identified 4 key barriers to evidence uptake. 1, time pressures, which we discussed today. Funding constraints is that you're always working within a constrained environment. There's a limited amount of funding, a limited amount of resource that you can allocate to a humanitarian context, and you want to use those resources efficiently. There's lack of relevance to humanitarian practice. There's, again, that sense that, you know, people who work within the humanitarian sector who are on the more purist side will argue that it's more about the humanitarian response. It's about meeting the needs of affected populations. And again, in that situation, then evidence generation becomes a luxury. It doesn't become a priority, does it? And then lack of relevance to humanitarian actors in the global south. And this is important. And I will go back to that point a number of times in my presentation. I'm not going to take very long. I will go back to that point that there is a need to think about evidence generation from a southern perspective that we are constantly missing out on, especially in northern discussions, and that needs to be addressed. The root causes, in my view, are systemic. And this includes a number of issues. One is that if we regard that disconnect between evidence generation and practice as just a one-off thing within the humanitarian sector, we're actually missing the big picture. The bigger picture is that there is a knowledge or an epistemic inequality that's informing all of that. And I will explain how. But the fact is, most of the research that's being developed on conflict or humanitarian action is largely developed by northern scholars, largely developed by scholars who are at the very least educated in northern countries. So there is an inequality in terms of knowledge production and uptake. And that has an impact, again, on the relevance point. It has an impact on the capacity to really make use of that evidence in the humanitarian response in countries in the global south. There are also humanitarian crises in the global north. So that is not to say that they only happen in the south. So the situation in Ukraine is an example. Right now in the United Kingdom, a lot of the funding that would have gone to southern countries or would have gone to humanitarian crisis now being used domestically in order to respond to the need for funding for refugees and asylum seekers, for example. And so there's a level of nuance there that also needs to be taken into account. But overall, there's still a very strong knowledge epistemic inequality that is informing broader inequalities in terms of evidence generation in northern and southern evidence generation. The other point is around research capacity constraints. So again, humanitarian contexts, organizations don't necessarily have researchers who can dedicate time to doing research on humanitarian needs. And even if that was the case, the emphasis on robustness and methodological rigor tends to be lacking. And we tend to always go for, the usual traditional methods, doing qual research, a quick literature review, doing maybe a survey here and there, but there isn't there is still a need to really dig a lot more deeply into the variety of methods that we use and the amount of methodological rigor that is possible. There are funding limitations, and which we've discussed, and there are lack of clear routes to impact. And now, most of calls for proposals that we get from big donors like IDRC, even UK government, FCDO funding and so on, they require a clear route to impact. How is your research going to result into impact? But then it's difficult to define what that impact is, right? Sometimes the impact is going to be small, and then you build it up into a larger impact. And so that puts a lot of pressure on academics and scholars to sometimes try to come up with theories of change or arguments so that they can win the funding and secure the funding without really necessarily being able to fully deliver on that. And as I said, the knowledge inequalities that I mentioned before are persistent inequalities within the humanitarian system. And there are a number of studies that I've worked on that actually point to the fact that there's a dearth of data on key issues like climate change and the impact of climate change on humanitarian issues in the Middle East, for example. There's very limited research on other issues that are more practical, operational, the delivery of response. So one study that I worked on that looked at communication, community engagement in the humanitarian response in Yemen, for example, pointed out that, you know, you have all of these quick needs assessments that get run and delivered, but they don't really speak to crucial needs of the populations. There's also a lot of respondent fatigue. So once a crisis hits, you get like 5 or 6 different research organizations going to the same country, interviewing the same people. So there's lack of organization as well that's impacted that lack of collaboration on the research front. There's also limited capacity to learn from previous crises. So recently, we held a roundtable discussion on humanitarian diplomacy in the Sudan crisis, and we're interested in looking at outside traditional humanitarian actors in the formal humanitarian architecture. And again, we learned that there's very limited reflection on previous crises like Myanmar, Yemen, and Libya, and so on. And it's very difficult to kind of learn from that and use it in current crises. And all of that is, again, pointing to that disconnect between generating high quality evidence, not just generating evidence, and translating that into impact and into practice. And that's contributing to a stasis within the humanitarian sector. A number of times I complain about going to conferences and talking about the same things. You know, every time I go to a conference, we talk about localization, and that localization is good, right? What does that mean? You know, we've been talking about it for more than a decade now. Very limited progress has been made. We try very hard to define how that progress can fit within particular metrics to show that progress is happening. But the reality is that, you know, there is broadly a lot more stasis in the humanitarian sector. Okay, in 1 minute. Okay, and there are also concerns around that the funding pot, the funding threshold for your traditional donors is going to shrink. You know, there's economic decline or economic stasis happening in the global north at the moment. We're already feeling that pinch in the United Kingdom and other countries within the EU. In the US, now with the Trump administration coming in, you know, the clarity of that funding donor landscape is going to change. And so there needs to be a lot more thinking about how that evidence process can be rectified. Now, so what do we do about this, right? So my argument is that we need a systems change approach to evidence. And I've suggested 5 entry points for change, okay? So the first point is that we need to experiment with new methods and approaches. So research on the humanitarian sector needs to be disruptive and needs to be brave in asking difficult questions. I don't want to see another study about whether localization is good or not, you know, because there's no need for that. We know it's good. How do you do it, right? The second point is embracing co-production research. There's a need to strengthen collaborations with national and regional experts, and I think the Center for Humanitarian Studies is doing a fantastic job, you know, bringing international experts with regional, local experts. We need to strengthen that, and it should be a requirement. Some donors are already pushing for it. In recent calls for proposals by RDRC, for example, required your principal investigator has to be from the Global South, based in the Global South. So not somebody like me who's from the Global South but based in the Global North, right? It has to be someone who is based in the Global South. And so it's pushed researchers to start thinking differently, right? And it's changed the landscape of collaborations. Localizing research methodologies, I think this is really crucial, that methods need to be tailored to the local context and not be prescriptive. Your usual standard, you know, qual interviews with a literature review, that needs to change. They need to be tailored to local context. In one country that we did research on, for example, in the Middle East, we realized focus group discussions are not familiar to the population. So there was a reluctance from participants to engage with us. So it was the wrong method, right? So there's a need to kind of tailor methodologies in a different way. Adopting reflexivity and equity from conceptualization. Now, That is really crucial. And where I sit in the START network, we're trying to push for that, as we're conceptualizing a research project or an impact evaluation, from the start, we're engaging local actors, that it's not a prescriptive way of saying we just want to run an impact evaluation about one of our projects. And then the last point is using transdisciplinary approaches and identifying new routes for impact. A lot of research now is combining the natural with the social sciences. So you bring somebody from engineering, somebody from a medical background, with an anthropologist, a social scientist together, and they think about solutions together. That's becoming a lot more prominent as well in the tech space, in the AI space. So those are my and that's an example of a monitoring framework that we use at the START network that helps us interrogate our research and our methods of evaluation. And finally, this is an example of an overview of the utilization of local indigenous knowledge that we did for the START network. Will help inform our work on our strategic direction in terms of evidence and learning overall. I'll stop there, and again, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sheirne. I think RACA has access to all the information available through START network. We need to discuss some of the ideas further. What Dr. Sheirne has talked about requires more discussion, like the difficulties encountered by charitable organizations when it comes to research, and Dr. Sheirne has given us some ideas as how they do this in her network START. Our next speaker, Dr. Sheirne, has taken 5 extra minutes. So Dr. Salim, your turn now. Dr. Salim Salama is the Executive Director of the WISH organization, which is an affiliation of Qatar Foundation. He is a physician. He has an experience of 25 years in public health and internal medicine. He started with the Geneva University and Geneva Hospital, and he took part in the Geneva Forum for Health, and he worked with the WHO for more than 10 years, and he was a regional advisor with them, and then he worked at the headquarters in Geneva, and he provided advice to many countries throughout his career. Dr. Salim, the floor is yours. In the name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate, سعادة الدكتور ماجد الأنصاري المتحدث باسم وزارة الخارجية، الزملاء الأفاضل، السيدات والسادة، دعوني أولا أتقدم بالشكر لمركز دراسات النزاع وراكا وكما
I'm a practitioner by training in internal medicine. I spent a lot of time in this region, about 11 years with WHO across 22 countries. Half of them are in emergencies, and 10 years with Doctor Without Borders on their board. So I work from an experience of countries, and this is what I would like to bring. I'm not a researcher per se, but research is a very important contribution. As the introductory remark of His Excellency, I think at the end of the day, what we want is for people to benefit from investment for our actions and make sure that that impact is measured, rely on good evidence, and I will build very much on what Sheirne just mentioned. The first point I would like to make is the context where we operate. We don't see the humanitarian landscape as we used to see it 10 or 20 years ago, and this is just a graph from the World Economic Forum around the risk. Some scholars refer to polycrisis or even permanent crisis we are in, and there is a concomitant risk that we are exposed to in many parts of the world. Environmental and climate change, geopolitical, and we are in the eye of the hurricane with all, the conflicts and the attacks that are also affecting the healthcare sector and the humanitarian response. Economic and the cost of living, societal with tension also on large migration, unprecedented migration, but also the technological challenges and risk, potentially a risk and benefit of technological advancement, but also if you look at cybersecurity and other aspects that actually are shaping the humanitarian landscape, the use of AI for the good, but also for evil, as we have seen it in recent development. So this, of course, affects the humanitarian landscape and where we operate. On the right side, this is just the launch of the Lancet Commission. There was in one of the very renowned medical journal, there was a new commission that just started last May on conflict, health, and forcibly displaced population, because we are really witnessing a complexification of the crisis, humanitarian crisis of large magnitude, but also duration. In average, a humanitarian emergency lasts 15 to 17 years. It's no longer just a cycle where we rebuild. We hear a lot about rebuilding Gaza, but when you look at the situation of Gaza in many of our countries in emergencies, they have been there, and there is a cycle with burst, but we never go out fully of a cycle. So that understanding, I think, of the protection of the crisis, I think, is an important one in terms of funding, in terms of operation, in terms of how we work with communities, as Sheirne mentioned, to look at resilience and building also capacity to be able to address those multiple shocks. Natural disaster and extreme weather, this is something that will increase, and with this, livelihood aspect about forcibly displaced population is something that we witness. What I would like to point out as well is that from a health perspective, as the world is aging, as the world is moving away from infectious disease to some extent to addressing more maternal and child health, we have chronic conditions. I have been working 15 years with Gaza. My frustration has been to see the hospital for cancer patients that we just initiated 1.5 years ago being destroyed, which means that when we address humanitarian responses, we need to look at that long term, and with the long term, there is a lot of unmet needs. You see the trauma, you see the direct impact, but we don't see people with diabetes, people with cancer, people with dialysis that require a health system, and this takes decades to build. And I think the charitable organization need to think about health system strengthening from a systemic approach is not something that comes overnight. It's an investment that takes years. And I think as part of this, preserving those investments are critical. But this goes with the transition that we are witnessing across the globe. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, about 1/3 of the mortality of people are related to non-communicable disease and not just only to infectious disease anymore. The other point is really the high number, unprecedented number of forcibly displaced population. Since 2017, we have more people displaced within their own borders, what we call IDPs, internally displaced population, than refugee. We see a lot of focus in Western countries on refugee numbers, but basically we have much more to deal with within own countries and IDPs. I think this is something that would also increase. One worrisome experiences, and I have been almost 30 years in humanitarian response, is also the increasing normalization of the violation of international humanitarian law, and you have seen it with the most extreme atrocities that are being conducted in Gaza, but in Sudan, in Myanmar, you name it, in Ukraine. We have just released last week as part of the WISH with WHO a report called Line of Fire, documenting the attack on healthcare since 2017. More than 7,000 attacks on healthcare facilities. This has become the norm, and despite the fact that OR have rules, those rules have been systematically not addressed, and this is something that we also need as part of our advocacy, as part of humanitarian advocacy, to maintain that schools, shelters, the protection aspect of the cluster, there will be no humanitarian response, no impact if we don't protect. And we have had a couple of months here, I think a session commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Convention. And I heard some scholars saying that, yeah, but this is Solferino, Henri Dunant, it was in the West, and the principle of humanitarian law do not apply on our context. I oppose this strongly. I think even when, during the Balkanic War, we have had scholars and Islamic scholars have revisited the international humanitarian law. There are some principles in terms of the protection of civilians in conflicts that are grounded in our own Islamic principle. I think this is something that we need to stand very strongly as a foundation for any part of the response. Health policies against that evolving landscape have not really matched the change. There is very much an old paradigm of large camp refugee, starvation, infectious disease being prominently the cover, and we have seen in both in the research, in the funding, in the operation, that we have been very slow from a health perspective at look at how effective we are in our health intervention. I had the chance to evaluate many of the programs from charity organizations from this part of the world in many of our countries, in Yemen, in Somalia. I think there has been a lot of challenges in our ability to adapt to this new context. And this is a landmark article that Paul Spiegel from Johns Hopkins wrote about 15 years ago, looking about this change of profile of the population that we will have to respond to, but also in what are the needs and the evolving needs and how we are operating in those contexts. More recently, some colleagues have also developed a review of health research and capacity strengthening, specifically in conflict areas. There are, and I will allude to that, to the difficulty and the challenges of conducting research in conflict areas. But basically, their conclusion was quite appealing, is that there is almost no capacity and research capacity to do health research in those settings, that most of the health research are conducted by NGOs who have access to some extent to those settings. Academia have been restricted to this, and as Sheirne mentioned, a lot of those research has been conducted from Western countries, mainly in our settings, mainly descriptive, not much analytical, not much using mixed methods or different methods that are also mobilizing and empowering affected communities. So there are a lot of similarities with just what Sheirne mentioned in the health sector as well. And some aspects are related to the dynamic of strategic partnership and how these research collaboration have been established at the first, but also the focus of the research and the research question. And this comes again to these epistemologic inequalities about who designed the research, what are the research questions, and how do we conduct research in those environments. Sheirne have referred to ELRA. It's an enhancing learning and research for humanitarian assistance. There are very few initiatives that really have tried to use and generate evidence on the efficacy and effectiveness of our intervention. I just take that illustration because it's one of the networks that who have been funding also research. These are two comparative reviews. One was in 2015 on the evidence review of health intervention in humanitarian crisis. Very weak, I would say, even from a health perspective. Most of the studies were drawn from UNRWA, which for me is more established and very limited information about acute or response to health emergencies in particular. The 2021 have drawn much more on actual responses and countries and the diversity, so probably much richer. But this is really a gap in our ability also to understand what is happening, what is our intervention in those countries, what are the gaps in our ability to respond from a health perspective. Some development that are also interesting. A full journal of the BMC now since 2007 have been open access as well to try to disseminate specific findings on conflict and health in particular. I think it's a good way forward. There are still, again, I think some aspect of hegemony of where the research and who decide on what get published. I think this is something that But here we have an example also of a field of research that for me would be interesting from the Syria conflict about non-communicable disease, and using an approach that look at the political economy. Operating, for instance, in Syria, and we have been part of the whole of Syria approach, in non-government control areas, when your right hand and your left hand do not know what each is doing, it's very complex to conduct research. But it's fundamental when we want to serve the entire population to understand how an informal health directorate operates to maintain provision of essential care. This is what this paper is about, trying to have a mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative, to look at what has been actually the experiences in maintaining and preserving non-communicable disease provision services at that example. As I mentioned, conducting health research in conflict setting is challenging from various reasons, from a contextual, from security, from the ethical consideration of the vulnerable population that we are studying, on the security for even the identity of who is conducting this, whether outside or in the country. There's methodological issues about forcibly displaced population and the ability to sample, the study design, the data collection at all aspects. It doesn't mean that we should not do it, but there is clearly an area that we need to build that expertise to be able to conduct those research, including also on getting approval, funding, to be able to move in or out also staff when we're conducting those research, let alone when the researchers are part of the humanitarian responder, which is often the case, that put also themselves and maybe the community that are studies at risk. There are, you were asking about also solution and some area of, there are some consortium that have been set up also between, again, the north and the south to some extent, and with us, I would say, mixed results. And I think we need to be honest about it. I mean, this is one example of research for health in conflict that have put together King's College London with a number of entities, IUB, HEP University in Turkey, working on conflict in the Middle East. And you have, after a couple of years from 2017 to 2021, they have for the first time reviewed the experiences. I think this piece of work is also interesting, is not only reviewing the impact, but reviewing the network and the research network, how they function. And similarly to what Sheirne mentioned, they point out to the same. The importance of working together, but the importance of acknowledging that power imbalances, who was the PI, young researchers as part of the network, the ability to speak out, the ability to co-design, funding streams. So multiple themes that Sheirne have evoked actually are also translated into this. Another example with Rebuild, more focusing on the ability to create resilience in health system in countries, initially between a number of countries in the Middle East and the UK, but have been extended also to multiple countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Uganda, for instance. And these are a collection of pieces of work that need probably to be further supported and making sure that that evidence is used and transposed across disciplines, because there's a lot of lessons learned that are not necessarily health specific that actually can be brought to the discussion. I will also start with what Sheirne mentioned, and I'm very strong on that. Have been raised myself in Switzerland. This is from the KFPA, the Commission of Research in partnership with low and middle-income countries. And there was a full movement about decolonizing global health, but decolonizing research at large. I think very much of those partnerships are still unequal. And the transactional relationship that many of the GCC countries have built in funding is not enough. I was last week with colleagues of the Global Fund, and I was saying the narrative in how we engage need to change. Funding is one, but co-designing, empowering our own constituencies is important, and the people that we serve as well. I think there was an ethical approaches of how we develop those research partnerships that need to change, and I really hope that this discussion will lead also to this contribution. Take-home messages. Humanitarian crisis clearly pose a major threat to health and dignity, and we need to increase our ability to have evidence-based intervention in humanitarian setting to really maximize the impact, and measuring how much of what we do is impacting health. And measuring health impact is not something easy. Sometimes it's more an output of number of beneficiaries. To see really the health impact requires sometimes time. But that requires investment and political will to build the research capacity in these particular settings, taking into consideration the ethical and operational challenges that I alluded to, and also addressing those power asymmetries and unequal relationship that Sheirne already mentioned in her presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Lots of these points really require more in-depth discussion about the tools of research to implement humanitarian work in health and in conflict settings, and also the obstacles that we often face as scholars and researchers that we can talk about in length. But we also need to discuss what means we have at hand to enhance synergy between research and field practice. Our final speaker in the session is Dr. Khaled Shati. Dr. Khaled is now the president of the Kuwait Center for Documenting Humanitarian Work, FANAR. He is also the chairman of the Board of Trustees at the Kuwaiti Endowment for Humanitarian Work. Dr. Khaled has a PhD in volunteering work in Islamic Sharia with the experience of the state of Kuwait from the University of Qawin in Morocco. He has over 30 years of experience in volunteering work and charity associations. He has great contributions in developing non-profit sector and enhancing the role of humanitarian institutions in Kuwait. He participated in many committees that enhance the community or social role of charities. He also authored and co-authored many papers and books in volunteering and charity work. Please take the podium. In the name of God, most merciful, most gracious, peace and mercy be upon Prophet Muhammad and his family and companions. Peace and God's blessings be upon you. I welcome everyone and I thank you for attending this important conference. Today we will talk about humanitarian work, which is getting more and more important. In the beginning, we were talking about humanitarian work and its achieving sustainability and achieving the SDGs set by the UN by the year 2030, urging humanitarian associations and the private sector institutions and the government sector to achieve well-being and development for the populations of the world. This was the line or the route in which the humanitarian associations were working, but now we are finding a huge burden on humanitarian work. Right now, the plan is not to achieve sustainable development in the UN, but to solve the problems that are happening, provide aid, and ending the calamities and the catastrophes that are happening around the countries of the world. So the root of these organizations, humanitarian organizations, conference are, as Dr. Sheirne and Dr. Salam mentioned, the humanitarian work plan. It is focused on aid and relief. In the beginning of the SDG plan, our ambition was to achieve more well-being, more development, more projects, sustainability and rehabilitation, education, environment, so many projects that we had the ambition of achieving. But today we find the world plagued with conflict. So all the humanitarian work is focused on resolving all of these conflicts, and this puts more responsibility on our shoulders as humanitarian organizations and other institutions, indeed, to carry out studies, research, and enhance our work. And Dr. Majed talked today about allocating income for research that feeds into humanitarian work. I remember in May 2024, there was a conference in Kuwait by the international charity organization, along with OCHA and other organizations, about the recovery after war in Gaza. Over $2 billion were collected in pledgings by these states to intervene in the recovery of Gaza. And we ask what is the budget that is allocated for research out of these $2 billion. What is the budget for research today? There's a great deal of shortcoming in research for humanitarian work, and today I address the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, since we have the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Qatar here today, and of course they have a great role in humanitarian work at the international level. Today, humanitarian organizations are so occupied with their work, they do not have a moment to spare to think about budgets, to think about academic work and the future of this academic work. So the Ministries of Foreign Affairs really should allocate a budget and assign a number of researchers and scholars to support research, to anticipate the future. Also, we could have other parts of their budgets be allocated to aid humanitarian associations to carry out their own studies and research. I believe that academic universities in these states should also have a role and contribution in conducting research. Even master's and PhD theses and papers should be advised, the students should be advised towards carrying out their theses about this issue. There are also research centers. For example, our center, FANAR, for documenting humanitarian work. I worked for 30 years in humanitarian work. I mean, everyday field humanitarian work that is completely separate or secluded from all this talk about research. We were so occupied with our everyday humanitarian work, our everyday duties. So, in the middle of my work in charity, I engaged in research, academic work, and I did my PhD on volunteering work in Kuwait. And when I came back to the field work, I once again was occupied with my work in charity. So we established a studies unit to support decision making. We had 3 academics, 3 people who had their PhD focusing on this specialization or this specialty. And so we focused on the needs, ambitions, future of this humanitarian work. And again, in my field work, when I returned to my field work, I decided to to dedicate myself for research, so I founded the Center for Documenting Humanitarian Work in 2019 to be specialized in conducting research. And so we looked into the documentation of the already done charity work and the annual reports. So of course, we have charity associations such as Riaya Islamic Care in Kuwait, which has been operating for 40 years. The new employees, workers, and their partners as well are really not aware of so much information, such as visions, missions, and values. And so we started working with the charity associations to first prepare a report and publications about their charity work along the past years. So we had a Salama institution in 10 years, Al-Sidra Association for the Care of Cancer Patients along 10 years, positive care for the patients of cancer along 17 years. So our plan in Fanar Center was to document the humanitarian work done or to be done or is being done by these associations. And then we started with the work done by the associations, such as the administrative and financial reports of these associations. We started connecting the annual report with the state plan 2035. So what have you achieved in this year as a charity association, as a humanitarian association, and how does this connect to the state's plan for the following years? And we started linking these charity associations, their annual reports, and their also their past reports to the UN's SDGs 2030. So there was a linkage to document all of this humanitarian work. We aim to document humanitarian work inside and outside Kuwait, and our mission is to document this work at a high level of values, motivate the upcoming generations. The reports that we are issuing through humanitarian associations provide more transparency and trust vis-a-vis the private sector, the partners, the government, and this is very important. And we are trying to document all of this currently. And we also aim to document humanitarian Kuwaiti and international work and promoting the culture of documentation, also enhancing income and developing institutional structures, media structures, supporting Kuwait. We also support students studying or conducting research. We provide them with figures and statistics to conduct their research. We have over 5,000 publications in our institution that we are collecting, including statistics, research papers, to give access to students and scholars and researchers to reach studies in their fields of expertise, be it political, developmental, marketing. They can refer to our bank of studies and research in one place. And of course, as Dr. Majed said, we do have a problem in financing, in funding. So we have efforts to convince and motivate businessmen to establish endowment, Islamic endowment, to support humanitarian work and humanitarian work research. We know that many universities in the US and in Europe are based on endowment of these assets for research. Among our publications, we have the Fanar magazine, and it's issued every 3 months, and it focuses, for example, on people with disabilities, environment, children, cancer patients. So we try on these international occasions chosen by the UN to focus in our issue on the efforts and the associations focusing on these efforts to have networking partnership with these institutions. And we are also establishing or drafting documentation books that are issued every 3 months, as well as media publications and leaflets about the work of associations. We have many books documenting humanitarian work, and of course, today we are seeing humanitarian associations being called terrorists and being interrogated about where their money is going. So, of course, all of these associations are trying to document their work, to get the ISO certificates, to be recognized internationally. So, we documented around 15 associations in Kuwait that acquired the ISO, and when we established our publication, I was contacted by the person in charge of humanitarian work in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He said that this book documenting these associations and their certificates is the most important one for us. It gives us relief, transparency about humanitarian work, so that we can continue this humanitarian work and we can continue resolving the conflicts happening right now. States today cannot achieve development for their peoples alone. They need the third sector, they need humanitarian work, they need initiatives and partnerships. And so we are giving a reassurance for this humanitarian work by conducting this research. And we have documented some charity work, such as the CAFOL Association, for the care of prisoners and their families. And now the embassies of countries inside Kuwait are visiting this institution to learn about their plans, their procedures, activities, and partnerships between them and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Justice, and how they work in partnership with other institutions to release prisoners, to care for their families while they serve their sentence. And we have this magazine in Arabic, which was translated into English. It was accessible to countries this way to transfer this experience to other countries in the Arab world and around other parts of the world. We have also radio programs, television programs, a website, social media platform accounts, and we will be inaugurating the Wikipedia of humanitarian work. It's called WikiKhair. It will be accessible and available. All the information, reports, research, studies concerned with humanitarian works will be published on this electronic platform named WikiKhair. It will be inaugurated very soon. It will give the opportunity for students and researchers alike to get to know the studies that we have, and also research centers and also ministries can access and get to know this research and coordination about it. And we can also anticipate the needs of humanitarian work in the future. We have this library in our center, and we have collaborations with research and study centers. We try to convince them, we're starting in Kuwait and GCC, we're trying to convince them to include in their research some part about humanitarian work as a contribution. Perhaps they are, a lot of the time, they are preoccupied in other fields, but we are trying to ask them to contribute to the research in humanitarian work. And also we have a message to researchers and to students to do the same. And this is the Kuwait Endowment for Humanitarian Work, in order to have a sustainable resource for humanitarian work work. And so any institution that would like to engage in such efforts can refer to this endowment. And I thank the Humanitarian Studies and Conflict Center and the Charity Associations of Qatar and the organizers and the state of Qatar for organizing this conference about this important topic about humanitarian work and its needs and its struggles and challenges. And in conclusion, I hope that I have given an overview of this institution about research and studies on humanitarian work. And this institution is a non-profit organization established in Kuwait 2017. In 2017, the state of Kuwait allowed the establishment of non-profit organizations that are autonomous, independent, that generate income, but this income is used in their activities for research as well. So it is our honor to work with any institution that would like to work with us here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor. This is an inspiring experience, and we really hope to work with you. And all of these activities are a humanitarian work researcher's dream, and you've found many solutions to problems that we talked about regarding finance, endowments, and Kuwait is known for the success of its endowment institutions. And as you said, there's sustainable financing, there's coverage of activities at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. We are working on the Arabic Encyclopedia project right now, and all the team members in the Arab Center and the Conflict Center here are required to give input to enhance the Arabic content and to make it accessible for Arabic language reader. And what you talked about actually are main themes and issues that will be included in this encyclopedia. So I believe there's a huge space for cooperation between us. Thank you very much, Doctor. We have exhausted our time actually in these presentations, but they were dense and enriching, and so perhaps we can take 15 minutes for a discussion. Let's give the opportunity to the attendees if there are any questions. Go ahead, please. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the organizers. Ma'moun Ariqat, humanitarian work researcher. I believe the ideas that we talked about this morning really answer the question why. The question now is how. So I propose for the conference to propose the establishment of a cluster to research or to have research about every crisis, every humanitarian crisis. So part of the government funding should go to these crises. For example, we have Syria, Palestine, Yemen, 3 crises, and Palestine is a continuous, actually, chronic crisis. So we should have clusters, cluster for research and development that provides researchers with visiting from all around the world, tools, information, and the atmosphere appropriate for researching the local affairs of these crises. So a cluster, an initiative that can be proposed by this conference and funded by the Qatar Development Fund. It could enhance the synergy between research, evidence, and practice. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled. Shati, I have a question. Dr. Khaled is, of course, the spokesperson for charity work in Kuwait, and he has a weekly program where he talks about this work. Dr. Khaled, the efforts of Fanar Center are great. The documentation that you mentioned is really amazing work. My question is about the documentation of any work. For the audience, we always shed light on the positive aspect. We need to document charity work of these associations and look into the lessons learned. So after all these documentations, what are the mistakes that we have committed and that we can avoid in the future? For example, you talked about an association that worked for 40 years. They do not know about the history of their association. So how can we talk about the lessons learned? Because of course, documentation is really an exhausting kind of work to talk about work that lasted for 40 years. How can we talk about the lessons learned and then have discussions with those concerned in order to have recommendations? Even if we don't publish these lessons learned, it could be private to these institutions. Dr. Sheirne, thank you for your presentation about localizing charity work. Do you have any examples with the SART network that can inspire us? Because localizing charity work in various countries is incredibly important. Unfortunately, charity associations, especially in the GCC, always take the initiative to implement charity work abroad. And then after a while, if there's any problem with this charity association, the work stops completely. But when the charity work is localized in these states and the capacities are built in local institutions, I believe this would be a transformational change in charity work. I hope you have a positive experience or a positive example about that. Thank you. Peace and God's blessings be upon you. We thank the regulatory authority for charitable activities and all the organizers. I have a question. I work at the Association for People with Disabilities. You did not talk about research directed towards people with disabilities, especially in light of the challenges that we are witnessing in the region and the increasing number of people with disabilities that we see even in our association, and also the emergence of new cases, polio, which had been eradicated. We're having breakouts of polio again. So I hope that there are recommendations to motivate work in humanitarian, motivate research in humanitarian work specifically for people with disabilities. Thank you. Peace and God's blessings be upon you. Bashar Kasabi from Midad Center. So my recommendation is related to the title of the session, which is Advancing Research Practice Synergy. I believe the synergy has many facets and tools. When we talk about scientific research and charity and humanitarian work, we need to have roots for enhancing and promoting the practice of humanitarian work based on evidence, based on research. So the root of conflict, a root of a crisis or a disaster needs a specific kind of data. Also for development work requires a different nature of data, a different approach, a different methodology and tools. And the provision of information is not limited to the time of crisis and shouldn't only focus, this research shouldn't only focus on the time of armed conflict. No, we need to have another element focusing on development. We need to have continuous inflow of information and exchange of expertise. This is one facet. The other aspect is this lack of information is a result. So why? Why do we have this lack of information and evidence at the level of human resources, at the level of the influx of information at the level of humanitarian work. So the humanitarian work should employ all kinds of efficiencies and also network with various partners and have information that cater for various disciplines such as emergency, such as development, such as participatory work with the local communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hadi. This is a very nice discussion indeed. I'll bring one idea from cancer to humanitarian and developmental work. We know there is a cancer registry where there's a database where a number of variables or standards which are gathered continuously. Like, I mean, we have START network collaboration and work with humanitarian organizations and other relative organizations. And the doctor has just explained to us that bring everything to a local level, and data should be produced continuously so that research can continue. There is not just a minimum data set, but the efficiency matrix. We talk about this, but we have to agree at a local level on what efficiency standards we should, because efficiency matrix can differ from one area to another. Now we have the Qatar National Fund for Research is giving grants to research, to fund research in this sector, and I agree with the speakers that there has to be a cluster for research, and there is always a discussion, should every research should be peer reviewed. I think when it comes to charitable work, this is becoming an obstacle, a barrier. There is nothing wrong with a white paper, a policy document. These are all very important, but sometimes researchers are not enthusiastic about them because the international research community is not giving it enough value. And because of these barriers, I think we have to move towards white documents and grey evidence more and more. Thank you. Regarding your question, Abdul Rahman, on reports on the achievements of organizations, usually these reports document the social impact, the positive aspects, and as for the challenges, problems, or negative aspects, these are presented through research or papers which are not for publication. They are done as references that you can refer to inform your work. Sometimes this negative kind of reporting can have an impact on the donors, on the organizations themselves. Actually, we provide these reports when we are specifically asked by some organizations to provide them with information on that, research on that. Then we need research which deals with obstacles and problems. But by and large, we do not prefer to publish them widely, but only circulate them amongst the necessary stakeholders. As for people with disabilities, I think this can be part of the recommendations that ministries and other organizations, we're talking about government ministries or organizations caring for people with disability, should really come up with their own proposals and present them to humanitarian organizations so that they can interfere and intervene. And normally this is expected from government agencies and ministries. And also government agencies and ministries should provide statistics to charitable organizations to inform them. We have many questions, but unfortunately, we do not have enough time for that. But it's important to ask. Your organization is a very inspiring organization in this region indeed, but unfortunately, we don't have time. We hope and we look forward to more discussions.
I think when it comes to localization, I think there are three spaces where the START network is localizing humanitarian response. So the first space is where our governance structure is concerned, Al-Hawkama governance. So we are governed by a board of trustees, and the board of trustees, the way it's constituted, is majority of which comes from different parts of the world and people who have deep experience in humanitarian contexts. And then part of that board of trustees forms what we call the assembly. And the assembly is really a very important mechanism for governing the organization. So I sit on the senior leadership team. So the way all my work, or the kind of the reporting structure and the kind of direction, strategic direction for my teams, comes from the assembly, and it comes from the board of trustees and the CEO. So that's kind of the structure. And I think that governance structure is really, really important, because it means that even though we're an organization that's based in the United Kingdom and registered as a charity within the UK, we are answerable. We answer to our board of trustees, we answer to our assembly, and it means that we have an accountability to the populations that we serve. So that's one. The other space where we are localizing humanitarian response is when it comes to finance. And this is really, really important. The organization that I work for has a very strong operational arm to it. It is about localizing humanitarian finance. And so we've got a very strong focus on anticipatory finance, on pushing humanitarian funding directly to local organizations. And so we act very much as a facilitator for humanitarian funding to go directly to source. And so we work with international donors, with FCDO, with other big grant makers and donors, and we facilitate that the humanitarian, the funding goes directly to source, and we facilitate that it also goes into kind of our anticipatory finance mechanism. So we've got what we call the Start Ready Fund and the Start Fund. The Start Ready is the anticipatory arm. So it's the one where if we know that based on the scientific evidence that a disaster is going to hit in a particular area, or drought is going to hit in a particular country, then we're able to anticipate that and push the funding in before the crisis actually hits. So that's our Start Ready arm. Start funds are the ones that are more kind of reactive to humanitarian crises. And then the third space where we're localizing response is that evidence and learning and innovation piece, which I see are very much interdependent on one another, which means that we do a lot of evaluations of our work, of the impact of our work, and we do a lot of research that kind of helps feed into our funding mechanisms. And so all of that, if you look at the cycle, all of these pieces are fitting into one another. So that's kind of my quick response on the localization point. The other point, which is also related on the methods piece, because there seems to be, I think I just want to highlight that we don't want to confuse what I call learning, evaluative research with evidence, or developing an evidence infrastructure and humanitarian response. And I think those two are interconnected. They can be interconnected, but they can be quite different from one another. What the humanitarian system does is we do a lot of evaluations, right? We evaluate a response, and sometimes it's part of our donor commitments. If you're using, you're funding in a particular country, you want to go back to the donor and say, X amount of money was successful in reaching X number of people, including more recently things around metrics around inclusivity of disabled populations, inclusivity of the elderly, and so on. But the problem is that, again, this is very static. It gets to a point where it just ends up being an evaluation report that you put into that you add to your kind of reporting to a donor, or you put on a website, and there's nothing there. There's no linking that learning to the evidence piece where you start thinking, what does that mean? What have I learned from that can inform humanitarian response more broadly in a global context? And I think where conversations happening here within the Center of Humanitarian Studies and the conversations happening so far, would love to see us thinking, how can all the excellent work that's happening by organizations, both academic as well as civil society organizations working here, how can they contribute to a broader global dialogue on how the humanitarian system needs to change and needs to be much more efficient, much more dignified towards affected populations? And that is not happening. Last point I'm going to say is that one of the luxuries that I have is that, and I don't think that this is something that people in Britain realize, is that if you want to understand what British attitudes are to the monarchy, 30 years ago, you can find that. Right? So where I used to work at the National Centre for Social Research, we run every year what we call the British Social Attitudes Survey, every year. So we've got a longitudinal database, evidence-based, that goes back 30 years on British attitudes towards taxation, towards healthcare, towards the monarchy, towards, anything that you can think of under the sun. So I can go back 30 years ago and understand how those things have changed. That evidence base is a huge luxury because it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, right? And so in the Middle East, where we are today, despite the fact that there's a huge interest in developing research, we need to articulate that slightly differently and start thinking about the kind of methods and the evidence infrastructure that we're building. And a longitudinal view, which the gentleman over there was talking about, is actually quite significant, because then you're able to see, are we making progress? Where is regression happening? How are we being impacted by broader geopolitical, changes that are happening in the world? And so, that is really important. That then shifts the conversation that we're having today from just talking about, are we doing evaluations? Are we publishing research? Into thinking, what kind of research do we really want to publish, right? How can we contribute more constructively and more meaningfully to conversations happening at the global level, not be at the receiving end of those, discussions, but be kind of active contributors to it. And I think, I think it's happening and it's getting there. And again, thank you very much for the organizers of this event. But that's where the conversation, in my view, needs to happen. Thanks.
أن تجري هنا لا نسمع المتحدثين من دون ميكروفون. We cannot hear the speakers without a microphone, please. That the paper would have lost its impact. Maybe it's just a means for academic promotion, nothing more.
First, I wanted to also respond to the disability. I think among the vulnerable the most vulnerable are people with disability, and I think this is still a neglect in our response. I come from WHO. We have tried in one part to try to shed a light also on the needs of people with disability, and I must say Qatar has been at the forefront as a country with the international conference coming on disability. Disability in conflict situation like we are witnessing at the moment, I think it's something that we need to probably work much more on and have a specific approach to it. On WISH and how this discussion relates, WISH is a convening platform for global health, and the health and humanitarian and approach is something that we would like to maintain as a transversal team, so that conversation, we need to amplify a couple of things. One is framing the discussion right and the global conversation, bringing the perspective from this part of the world is something I'm very strong about. There is and we see it even now in the humanitarian law and some of the distortion of the narrative that some countries, some belligerents are trying to introduce about who deserve to live and who deserve to die. So I think there is a political dimension also in everything that we do, is that bring back what bring universalism and humanitarianism at the center of the discussion. Why we are here is for that. And I think this is where we would like to contribute to the dialogue and framing the dialogue, bringing the right stakeholder, being inclusive is part of the design in everything that we have done. So what I can assure you is that we will focus on this, we continue. We just had, as I mentioned, a report on attack on healthcare. Everything that we are discussing today will not happen if we don't have a protective framework that makes sure that humanitarian law is respected, that civilians are protected, that schools, shelters, healthcare facilities are protected as the first place. And we had a close roundtable. We would like to mobilize the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the diplomacy on this, as putting this as education by all have done it, but under an umbrella of the protection of civilians in armed conflict in particular. And we have specific requests and recommendations that emerge, and I invite you to read the report on our website, Line of Fire, that document with WHO these attacks. So this is one of it, and I think the stream will continue. From the discussion today, what I would like to see as part of the conversation is mainly also for the role of Qatar is playing in a very important diplomatic role in the area of research, is probably continuing to fund perhaps a bit more. The cluster approach that a colleague was referring to is all our humanitarian response are divided by cluster: protection, wash, shelter, health, among them education. But I think having an approach similarly to the cooperation and development here, we have been very much geared toward the humanitarian. As I mentioned, most of our crises, at least in our region, are protracted, 15 years, 20 years there, so we need to take this into consideration. So the humanitarian and the development arm, probably like many development, if you look at most of the cooperation agency worldwide, have with also the big bargain, which has been the discussion around how we address globally humanitarian, is towards more flexibility, more predictability of funding, ability to build institutions and systems, and not just responding quickly to a response. Because even the discussion that I'm witnessing on Gaza at the moment, without a full peace, rebuilding means nothing. There had been a decade of rebuilding and conflict and rebuilding, and the same discourse happened. This starts at the beginning by the self-determination of people and putting people at the center, and being able to have that inclusive process is actually at the core. In terms of recommendation, I said perhaps funding by cluster, being the ability to have also health, education, different sectors being represented in the research in a much more granular way, starting with what you are supporting in countries. I did evaluation across the region on health programs from the GCC funding. Some of them were really poor. And we need actually to be honest, to be able to say, okay, some of those programs in the design have not been designed inclusively in a way that also see what's happening next, and not just build hospitals. It's about human capital. It's about building the design of a hospital with the people that will run the hospital and having a long-term perspective on it. And I think this is where I would see also progressively the maturation of the discourse here in Qatar through the Qatar Development Fund and the MOFA in support and alignment of the national strategy. This is where all of us as contributors, academia, NGOs can also align with ourselves. Thank you.
صندوق قطر لتمويل البحث العلمي. I agree with you, Dr. Salim, that in the humanitarian work we need policy papers more than peer-reviewed scientific research papers, which are more appropriate to academic work. I think peer-reviewed scientific research papers take a long time and they may lose their relevance when it comes to humanitarian. Now everybody is concerned with the rebuilding Gaza. If you want to prepare a paper that is peer-reviewed for Gaza, and this is a very sensitive issue which may be turned down by many, and even after a year and a half, we present a paper where Dr. Sheirne used to work. I think it took us 18 months to publish it, and by then the whole thing would have been over. Thank you very much. I thank our panelists, Dr. Khaled, Dr. Sheirne, Dr. Salim, and I thank you for your interaction. We have a 10-minute break. Please, thank you very much. Thank you.